Everybody, to this webinar called Integrated Youth Services, Now and into the Future, Collaborating for Equity, Access, and Outcomes. My name's Ian Boeckh. I'm with the Graham Boeckh Foundation, and I'm joined today by Alana Ludman, our Vice President of Youth Mental Health at the Foundation. Please feel free to use the chat to make comments, ask questions, and we would also really appreciate it if everyone would introduce themselves, their name and the organization that they're with. As well, once the presentations get going, I would be grateful if people would mute their microphones and turn off their cameras. GBF has been actually working to develop integrated youth services with many partners across Canada for 10 years. Time flies, and there's a tremendous amount going on, and as you'll learn, integrated youth services is really spreading rapidly around the country, and our foundation is also delighted to be able to say that we're reaching out to the remaining jurisdictions in Canada that don't have integrated youth services projects either underway or under development. And so we hope that all 13 provinces and territories someday can benefit from integrated youth services. And as many of you will know, the Graham Boeckh Foundation has been working, originally with CIHR for a partnership that funded Access Open Minds that really played a major role in getting integrated youth services going in this country. We've also been working with many provinces to help them develop integrated youth services projects, and we're also delighted that we're able to work with CIHR to create a major new partnership called IYSNet that will really work to help integrated youth services fulfill its potential in terms of really truly getting equity, access, and outcomes that the youth in this country need. And so one of the reason why we wanted to hold this webinar is that there are some exciting things happening, and I think there'll be a lot of opportunities for participation and collaboration in future. And so we wanted to start the discussion with stakeholders around that. And there's just a lot going on. So we thought that people could benefit from just a little bit of sort of navigation and finding out what are some of the things going on and how they fit together. So, and there is such a tremendous amount going on that unfortunately we couldn't feature everybody that's in a lot of the organizations that are actually doing work in integrated youth services, and just because of time constraints. And just to name a few examples, there's a terrific integrated youth services initiative in Manitoba. It's now been branded Huddle. Another example would be Frame, which is doing some great work around knowledge mobilization for youth mental health and integrated youth services. We sent out the agenda and the speakers and bios prior to this webinar, so you should have that. So I'm not going to repeat that, but we are delighted to have two additional speakers that can join us. Heather Ruderham is a psychologist and the interim director of mental health at Eskasoni First Nations. As well, Sierra Garrow has been a youth advisor at Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario. So welcome to both of you. And so we've got, additionally, as was in the agenda, Sam Weiss from CIHR, Steve Matthias with Foundry in British Columbia, Vidya Iyer with Access Open Minds, and Joanna Henderson and Sean Hill from Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario and CAMH. With that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Sam Weiss. Sam, take it away.
Thanks. Thanks, Ian. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen. Let me make sure I can do this properly. Is that working okay, Ian?
Yeah, that's fine, Sam.
All right, great. Thank you. So first of all, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. And I also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Calgary, which is in the traditional and unceded territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and that this territory is also the home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So I've been given the privilege to kick off the conversation and to talk about a pan-Canadian approach for integrated youth services as a learning health system. And I must say that it's not an exaggeration for me to say that this is probably the most exciting opportunity that I've involved with in my 40 plus years in brain and mental health research and knowledge translation in Canada. And I think that part of the excitement that we have is that we, meaning CIHR and the Graham Boeckh Foundation, as Ian suggested, have been working together for almost a decade to transform youth mental health services by driving a meaningful engagement with youth, their families, and caregivers to design and deliver the services of the future. And as you can see in this slide, integrated youth services includes both mental health and substance use services, primary care, work and employment supports, peer and family support, housing, other social services, and Indigenous programming in a seamless manner to ensure that ultimately no youth in this country is ever left behind when it comes to ensuring that their social and physical wellness is the concern of many. And so this history, this rich history, really began back when the Graham Boeckh Foundation and CIHR, working through this, the strategy for patient-oriented research, created ultimately and awarded Access Open Minds funding to allow them to begin to create hubs across the country that would really be driven by the needs of youth. And very shortly after Access Open Minds began, Steve Matthias created Foundry in BC as a precursor to what it is we're talking about today, which is how to ensure that each province and territory can have a network of sites that allow them to ensure the best outcomes for all youth in the region. And what you can see is that over time, both Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, Airvert Quebec, and a number of others that I'll mention in a moment, began to emulate this opportunity to create provincial hubs to support youth wellness. And it's quite remarkable that at the same time that each of the provinces was beginning to look at youth wellness through a network of sites, There were bilateral agreements that were arranged between the federal and provincial governments to support youth mental wellness, to the point that as these bilateral agreements are now being renewed and a Canadian mental health transfer is being considered by the inaugural Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, Carolyn Bennett, integrated youth services is at the top of everybody's mind because the provinces and territories are working together on it. And as a consequence of this, the Graham Boeckh Foundation and CIHR have renewed the partnership in a manner that we hope will allow the 13 provinces and territories to work together to create a learning health system for integrated youth services. Now, this just gives you a sense already about the growth of this activity across the country. The colors represent how each province is now creating their own. We've named just a few of them here, but you will see ultimately in the presentations to come that these are becoming, in each province and territory, a serious effort to ensure that youth receive the services they need and that the provinces share best practices in a collaborative fashion. The question is, can we take it to that next level to ensure that this becomes an example of a learning health system? So what is a learning health system? A learning health system is where services are generating data so that they can actually be measured, such that the data is acquired and is studied by researchers who can then outline new knowledge that emerges from this data to inform improvement of the practice in an iterative fashion, as you can see in this particular diagram here. And I think you'll see more examples of this from the other presentations. A learning health system ensures ultimately research data and service delivery overlap almost 100%. So what are these learning health systems and where do they currently exist? Well, mostly conceptually, but in a few places, we're starting to see learning health systems occur either in communities, in provinces, or even across and between provinces and territories. What's critical, and this will be why you'll see the conversations as they evolve today, is that research and data is essential to advance learning health systems. They allow you to understand whether or not what is being implemented is actually working and whether or not outcomes are actually improved. There are some examples of learning health systems in Canada in oncology, in neurology, and pediatrics, but learning health systems exclusively focused on mental health have yet to actually happen in this country. But we believe we're on the verge of seeing that happen for integrated youth services. So if you apply a learning health system concept to community-based mental health, as is integrated youth services, you will strengthen the programs and services, you generate evidence, you allow scale up, and you also can leverage and advocate this new knowledge to allow for permanent, sustainable funding, which can come from a combination of provincial, territorial, and federal governments. So the vision that we see now is that each province and territory delivers integrated youth services in its own unique fashion. But each of the provinces and territories will reach out and will collaborate with its partner provinces and territories across the country. And you'll hear examples of how this works. This works both at the level of service delivery, research, and data acquisition. And this allows ultimately a network of provincial and territorial networks that can serve every youth in this country. The final slide gives you a sense of the components of an integrated youth services learning health system. First and foremost, as I mentioned, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous-led delivery of integrated youth services, which focus on collaboration, knowledge exchange, and sharing of best practices. And Steve Matthias will speak about how this is already happening in this country and is growing. The IYS-NET concept, the evolution of Access Open Minds into provincial research partnerships between each of the provincial systems, is an opportunity to advance research network networking, evaluation, and evidence-generating models of care so that each province and territory can learn from each other and adopt the best practices that they see fit for their jurisdictions. And I'm particularly excited about what you're going to hear from Joanna and Sean about a pan-Canadian data framework. This is the dream of Canada, is to be able to have interoperative client records and open science-based data sharing that will allow us to collect data together and to allow researchers provincially, nationally, and internationally to mine the wealth of understanding of how services can improve outcomes for youth in this country. So you're going to hear all of these types of presentations today, which I think together constitute our vision for an IYS learning health system for Canada. And I can say that CIHR, the health portfolio, and Minister Carolyn Bennett are excited to learn more and more about this, to be able to support it. And tomorrow, in fact, many of these same speakers and 9 of the sites from coast to coast to coast will present their vision for an IYS learning health system to Minister Bennett and 12 other ministries of the Crown. So this is an exciting week for all of us, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to kick off today's webinar and look forward to the presentations and to the discussion afterwards. So thanks so much for your attention.
Sam, thank you very much. That was great. Now I'll pass it over to Steve Matthias. Steve?
All right. Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Ian, for that. I've been invited to speak to the Federation of Integrated Youth Services Network. So to speak to the subject of, and I think that it's really exciting. I've had opportunities to speak, I think, with this group on several occasions, and it's really exciting that today we can talk about more of this federation model that we're growing across Canada. Before I get too far, though, I just want to acknowledge with gratitude that our work takes place on land steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people today. We recognize and respect Indigenous people as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. I, for one, acknowledge that our land acknowledgements are merely words and that we will be judged ultimately on our actions. I currently reside on the stolen and traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh. The background and purpose of the Federation, I'll just share that I appreciate Sam's comments that I founded Foundry, but really I led a team that had a passion and a shared vision for improving services in British Columbia, and that team has been an amazing group of folks. But we managed to start this project a little bit earlier than other parts of the country. We started around a similar time as Joanna and her team in Ontario started theirs. And we realized very quickly that there were folks across the country who were interested in this model and who also wanted to learn from our mistakes because we were making a lot at the time. And I say that in bold honesty because I think that anytime you're doing something that's relatively new, it's really important to share lessons learned, both good and bad. And so with the support of Health Canada and the Bell Graham Boeckh Foundation, we partnered with Waihu to act as co-stewards of this pan-Canadian collaboration, understanding that we really needed to develop a structure that allowed us to exchange information and our latest innovations. And so while Sam has just talked about IYSnet with a focus on research and to an extent evaluation, Fission, as we call it, really convenes policymakers and provincial territorial IYS leaders in a forum focused on the advancement of IYS and everything that's involved in that. So our membership, and this is super exciting for us because it's really coast to coast and eventually coast. So we've had conversations with folks from all provinces and territories. And when we've convened so far, we've had members from 9 provinces, and I think our next one will certainly have 10. And so we're excited to see, as Sam talked about, the growth of this model, and that we really do have this model sprouting up in communities almost by the week, it would seem. And so, for instance, here in BC, we'll be opening up Foundry Comox next Monday. So that's it's a super exciting time for us and to see this growth. But we also know that there's a need for more. We likely need somewhere between 350 and 400 centers in Canada, and I think we have plans for just under 100. And so we need to continue to ensure that this model exists for all young people in this country. As we've come together to meet, we've recognized a membership from across this country that we have key themes to why we want to get together. We understand that we want to have a collaborative, unified approach. We understand that these models really do come from grassroots movements within provinces. But what we'd like to do is get to a place where we can exchange our knowledge and really start to see services have some common elements, so that our young people can really come to rely on the consistency of the services. That's where the common standards and principles start to arise, and we'll touch on the principles in a second. We also recognize that some centers have been open 6-7 years now, and there's an opportunity to mentor and network with communities that are maybe at same, so same size or same sort of demographic situations, but also opportunities for people to support newer centers as they come on board. And we obviously are resource sharing and have a need to continue to advocate for more of these services. So work to date of the Federation, we've met several times now. We'll get into one of our key activities, which is the development of common IYS principles in just a second. We've also talked about the creation of communities of practice, the building out of a resource repository, and we are fielding incoming knowledge requests on a regular basis, and we're looking forward to in-person convening in the fall of 2022, which is really exciting given how long we've been working together now on this. The Delphi process, just really briefly, this was something that was started in November, and this was led by an independent collaborator. What we did was we really collected all the principles, visions, and mission statements that existed across the country in this area. And so what we really wanted to do was just to pick out all of those, and we put them all together. And then we created an amalgamated and aggregated principles list based on all of those. And we had 24 principles for people to choose from. We then convened the Federation virtually. We brought members together to get feedback, and we used a Mentimeter to really understand where folks were at with these principles. And then we created a Qualtrics survey to get to a place where we could finalize those principles and start to cluster them. And so this is where we landed. And this is really exciting that when we talk about, having a science behind how we come to this list, this was, again, all of the IYS initiatives from across the country, which really reflected on the work that they had done to generate their principles and their mission statements. And so these, when you go down this list of principles, if someone were to ask me, okay, well, what are the principles of IYS? What does it mean? This is the commitment that we make when we say that we're working in an IYS model. We're committing to meaningful engagement, to being collaborative, to focusing on access and being youth-centered, to being responsive to the needs. And we saw that during COVID and the pandemic, to be culturally safe. And that's work in progress, and we know that. But that's a commitment that we make with these principles, that we're socially just, that we provide holistic care, and that we see multiple services being offered in one place, that we have a focus on health, not illness, intervening early, promoting health and health equity, and that we commit to learning and improving. And this is where, obviously, the IYS net model of researchers focusing on a learning health system and the Federation working alongside that comes into play. We've created this online community of practice. So we have a learning management system that is getting off the ground, and that will have resources available, videos for training available, for instance. We convene and discuss, share and create. So we'll be having discussion forums and a regular calendar of events. And the resource repository is probably the thing that I think people are potentially the most excited about at this moment. The resource repository came from just dozens and dozens of requests for documents and products that both Foundry and Waihu have created. Foundry, thanks to Health Canada, has had a fairly significant grant to create startup documents and over 50 knowledge products that are required to do this work. And so we've got, this is just an example of our table of contents for that resource repository, and it gives you a sense of what people are looking for. I remember having a conversation from one of our colleagues in the Maritimes, and they just said, it'd be great if we could just borrow a consent document. And we said, okay, let's look for that and get that to you. And then someone else said, do you have a job description for a clinical lead? We said, yeah, let's get that to you. So it's all about, creating efficiencies by being able to share out this type of information. I think that'll wrap up my my section here. But I just will say that this is really exciting for us to do this unprecedented work, and I'm glad for Sam, after a 40-year career, that this is the most exciting thing that he's been a part of, and then that hopefully this will end on a high note for him. But we'll just pass this along back to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Steve. And now I'll pass it over to Vidya and Heather.
Thank you, Ian. Good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to be here today and to follow these two really exciting talks by Sam and Steve. I think we're really at a very exciting and interesting moment in Canada. On the one hand, we have a lot to take stock of, to learn from the amazing progress that's been happening for the last 7-8 years in youth mental health, integrated youth services and youth services research. And on the other hand, as Sam pointed out, we have a lot to look forward to as we build something that's bigger, bolder, and beautiful. And my hope here today is to really sort of, in looking back at some examples and insights and learnings from the Access Open Minds network, which in some ways is really the sort of network that we are envisioning again, that connects multiple jurisdictions, multiple stakeholders, to use some insights and learnings and examples from the network to kind of in some ways nourish our imagination and excite and fire our appetites for thinking about what might be possible as we envision this learning health system. I took this picture from Sam's presentation that really brings together in some ways services, stakeholders, data, and science so that we can continuously improve and use data to improve decision-making and care for individual young people and their families, the quality of services, and also at a systems level, our collective knowledge and our collective capacity. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight was that as we're thinking about this, we really need to go back to, in many ways, where it began, is this real focus on values. I've listed some here that a learning health system needs to be founded on. And one of the ones that I'm trying to highlight in keeping with sort of the title for today's webinar is the link between data and equity. So many of you, almost everyone here is familiar with the Access Open Minds network, so I will not go into any details, but as Sam mentioned, this was the first strategy for patient-oriented research network that was jointly funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Graham Boeckh Foundation. It has sites in 7 provinces and 1 territory, urban, rural, remote, Indigenous, brought together multiple stakeholders, young people, families, service providers, Indigenous leaders, community organizations, policymakers. And in many ways, at these sites, services were transformed to identify needs early, respond to help seeking rapidly, and provide appropriate youth-friendly care. And one of the things that I want to highlight, since today's presentation really focuses on this idea of bringing to life the potential of data, was that through this, we had many experiences, like how do you create a strategy for data collection, both quantitative and qualitative, in collaboration with multiple stakeholders from multiple jurisdictions? What are the considerations? What matters to young people? What matters to communities? So how do you design such a data collection strategy? How do you embed it? And how do you use, given that we had a time frame for this project with the idea that we wanted to see the kind of scale that we're now seeing happen, how do you use this data in real time to impact practice and policy? And also in doing so, bring together indigenous and non-indigenous and important principles around self-determination and indigenous data governance. So I think it's been a fascinating experience, and I won't be able to go through all of that, but there's a lot that we can build on as we build the future. I've shown this before, and I just wanted to use some illustrative examples to say that even basic data on really describing who the young people are in their own voice. Who are they when they access services? Where are they coming from? What are their backgrounds? And for instance, in our case, we found when we did this, that access sites were serving a wide range of young people, including many who have been traditionally perhaps underserved or who may have been at risk of marginalization. So 39% of the young people across the 14 sites identified as LGBTQI2S+. So this is an example. And this was really also a way in some ways of designing forms that at once created, through just the kinds of questions it asked, a welcoming environment. If we sort of go a little bit further to illustrate a little bit this idea of the importance of data and the importance of tracking. I just have a simple sort of example, very high level, impressionistic, but still quite important. What you have here is data from 5 sites in Access, which are different in terms of their population size. And what you have is 3 columns. The first, the data for the Access site, about the young people who came into these sites. And the second column is the same variable for the population. So for instance, if it's a community, a small community, 3% of the young people who came in were visible minority, and in the catchment or the geographic area served by that site, 5% were visible minority. So what you can see over here is, if you see this sort of first column, you can have a rough sort of sense of, are there any gaps? And sometimes if there are small gaps, it doesn't mean automatically that there is a gap in equity, but at least you begin to start asking questions. Is there a difference in prevalence? If there is a huge gap, do we need to do something about outreach? Do we need to do something to make it more acceptable for different members of society to come to the service? The other 2 columns that you see are similar statistics, but for 2 other variables, one being the young people who are not in education, employment, or training, often called NEET, and the second being young people who have difficulty meeting basic needs. And again, what you see over here is across the board, when it came to these 2 variables, the trend was reversed, in that the young people who were coming into Access sites were much more likely to be NEET or have difficulty meeting basic needs than they are proportionally in the population served by these sites. So this is really sort of important because it highlights the importance of providing the sorts of interventions, evidence-based employment support interventions to make sure that young people have their needs for housing and basic needs met. So it really makes a strong case for that. And it's a quick and easy way of illustrating also the value of data and collecting such data using measures that are also collected at a population level. So does it have implications for how we think about interventions and for advocacy and for future sort of development of novel interventions? So when we found, for instance, a cross-access sites, and it was a similar sort of finding, in other like Waihu and Foundry, we actually partnered together to get funding for this large project, which includes sites from Youth Wellness Hubs Ontario, Foundry, and Access, that really is about embedding and evidence-based employment, supported employment in education and intervention. And part of the reason we were able to make the case is really using the statistics we had about the young people who were coming in and how many of them were actually identifying as not being in education, employment, or training. So sometimes when we think about data, we really think about complex things. And part of sort of the lessons through Access have been that some of the most beautiful insights actually come from very simple statistics or simple data. For instance, just figuring out where are our referrals coming from? How are young people finding out about Access? So one of the goals for integrated youth services and services like Access has really been to reduce barriers and to make it really easy and to increase actually young people's capacity for seeking help themselves. And what we found was certainly that about a large number and an increasing number over time were self-referrals or young people coming in on their own. And it was really nice because we also had multiple portals of entry. Young people were walking in, so a large number was simply walking into the site. And what we also found, which was really encouraging, is that those who might have been traditionally underserved or who are often seen as people who are perhaps reluctant to take up services or may have been at risk of marginalization were actually the ones to walk in for the most part. And here's where it starts becoming really important to make a nuanced argument when we're thinking about both data and about equity. So we found that those who were walking in were more likely to be NEET, more likely to be young men, more likely to be those who don't have a reliable adult, more Indigenous young people were walking in. But when it came to visible minority, we found that that was not actually the case. So this was not a method that was more likely for them, which means that we do continue to need to have different ways of promoting our service and different ways and different portals of entry that also allow for families and community organizations and those who are acting on behalf of young people to access services. So another really great example of the use of data. Overall, what we found, and I've just shown you some examples that are more related to equity or social determinants going along with sort of the theme for this webinar. What we found is that because we had data from such diverse sites, diverse contexts, we were really able to have the opportunity, the privilege in some ways of really unpacking a lot more this relationship between different social determinants and youth mental health presentations when young people come. And we certainly found that specific social determinants were related with higher levels of distress, more mental health problems, more work and study, social difficulties, like higher likelihood that young people came in with the presence of suicidal thoughts. But what was very important for us is that while some characteristics, like for example, not being employed or not being in school, seemed to be associated with problems in many areas, others had very specific patterns. For example, geography, while we often associate urban contexts, which was certainly the case with a higher likelihood of mental health problems, we really found that when it came to suicidal thoughts, even after we accounted for our Indigenous sites, suicidal thoughts were higher actually in the smaller and more medium population centers. So this really, again, highlights two things. One, the use of data, so we can prioritize interventions and design interventions that seem to be matching the needs of our young people. And the second, the use of data to really approach equity in a much more nuanced way. One of the biggest use of data that we've made in Access has really been for sites to be able to share their accomplishments and their stories and their impacts so that they could be sustained. Many of them have now become a part of the provincial networks. Many have had opportunities to talk to policymakers. So data for sustainability and scale has been a huge priority and emphasis. And here are two illustrations of reports that we've had the privilege of presenting, to provincial ministers, to Indigenous decision makers. And these have really had an impact also in shaping the conversation and advocating for more services and sustained services and scale up of these efforts as we see today. The last thing I want to say is that as we talk about data, I think it's really important to not forget the importance of also stories and qualitative data and photos and pictures. And one of the biggest things from Access has really been this idea that of bringing, in many ways, through different things that we do, the head and the heart together as we think about what we want to do next. So here's a really beautiful illustration of a photo voice project that the Youth and Family Council from Access led. So you see a photo there that really highlights the importance of cultural connection and cultural continuity as an essential and active ingredient as we think about youth services, and a quote from our qualitative interviews with young people. With this, actually, it's a perfect segue for me to pass this to Heather, who is going to share some insights from her vast experience and from the community's experience in thinking about data from Inescazoni First Nation. Over to you, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Vidya. Yeah, so my name is Heather. I was serving as the Access clinician, and I'm a psychologist by trade, and now I'm filling in for interim director role in Inescazoni. And I just wanted to start by saying I'm joining you from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and I'm really happy to be here. So Vidya just asked me to come on and share some specific examples of how we use the data from Access Open Minds to inform our practice. And I kind of wanted to share kind of 3 avenues or different areas where I could give examples. I have way more than these 3, but I have 5 minutes, so I'll stick to that. So I wanted to share, start from a systems and quality improvement standpoint. So we joined Access in 2016, and we started the implementation of the measures and the protocol. And we started to notice there's ways we can improve our service using this data. So Haley joined us in 2018 as our research assistant with Access Open Minds. And what she did was she took those measures and she created a more comprehensive intake process for our services for youth. And what it did was it helped us better understand the needs of the clients and where was their best match within our services. Through the process, we were able to understand the trends and concerns that the youth are bringing in, and we were able to identify how we can best respond to those kind of needs. So one example was Haley had noticed that there was a significant amount of youth coming in with self-harm, like in the adolescent years. And that was tracked through our presenting problems and through the intake process. And so she mentioned those kind of concerns to our clinicians and our program coordinators, and right away they're like, yes, we're seeing that too. And also because we are such a diverse working force, like we have clinicians, we have people with lived experience, we all had a different level of understanding of what self-harm is, how do we treat it, and honestly, people were kind of like very worried about what it was and standoffish on how to go about it. So, we just kind of went grassroots. We looked into Nova Scotia and saw who is a specialist in this field, and we reached out to Dr. Bagnall at the IWK. She's a psychiatrist, and the next day we had everybody gather into the office, and we had a virtual meeting with her, and she took a couple hours and took us through like a 101 and how to recognize and identify, get to the proper channels and proper treatment. And it just let our staff feel much more confident that they knew how to serve the community without pushing too fast, and how to care. And everyone kind of went away with a lot more confidence. So that was just kind of one. And it kind of speaks to the ability that the data lets us pivot and be flexible in any given moment to start kind of looking at what do youth need coming in. Another example was through the collection of demographic data and presenting issues again, we noticed the trends of trans and gender non-conforming youth coming in. and they were struggling to access hormone and surgical readiness assessments. So in Nova Scotia, this is a big barrier for people looking for gender affirming care. And so I was working with this youth, and they've been on this road trying for themselves. And I said, let me help you try and kind of access this service. So the fastest one we found was a 3-year wait list, and it was 4 hours outside the community. We know that when people who are gender nonconforming can't transition the way they want to, the gender dysphoria gets worse and suicide rates increase. And we just decided that was unacceptable. And so we did a little research, and we found that I could become a WPATH trained assessor through the IWK. So I took the training, and we've done a number of readiness assessments for youth in the community. No wait time, no barriers, and they get to move forward with their care. And if you are kind of knowledgeable in a little bit in trans healthcare, you will know that if you miss windows before puberty and before, like, the trajectory of treatment changes. So we need to do this in a more in a quicker manner, basically. And it was so important, and it was so needed, and we've already done a number of them for the community. When I went on maternity leave, we had trained Tess to be able to continue to do it, and so she's continuing the work in the community. And we're very proud of that. We've also used the data with funders and government entities to share, like, the impact that our services have had, and the impact for the youth in the community, and to push for sustainable funding, like we're all talking about at this table. A couple of examples, we just don't want to lose what we've built. And so a few examples are when we hosted the Honorable Minister Mark Miller, an MP, and Honorable MLA Brian Comer. They came in 2 separate visits. We were able to show the improvement for youth access service, as well as being able to speak to the investment dollars saved by investing in services in the community. And that's just the kind of big systems approach. And I'm just definitely trying to be quick, but another great experience that occurred as part of the understanding with the network was, as a network across Canada, we participated in the inter-rater reliability measures and practices. So we did vignettes, and we kind of scored the SOFAs and CGIs and different measures. And through that, we wanted to make sure we were speaking the same language and working from the same page as far as measurement goes. But it really allowed us to better understand the different realities that youth are present in, and how how context shapes how we kind of score these measures. And so, like, example, we noticed clinicians within Indigenous communities were scoring the SOFAs quite high because they were basing it on what they see on a daily basis. And what we see on a daily basis, for example, in Eskizoni, like, for children under 19 years, 75% are under the poverty line. So you're going to get a very different understanding of functioning from a youth in that community if I'm comparing it to other people who aren't doing as well within the community. Whereas if you go to the University of Alberta or Edmonton, or you have these different contexts, they were scoring things quite low, and we were thinking, well, those people seem like they're doing quite well. And so we were trying to figure out how, and what it really led to us is having very good conversations about the context of the site and how do we serve them. And it also led us to, like, kind of question some of the traditional measures and whether they are able to kind of go across all these contexts and give us the information we're looking for. If I could sneak one more in, which I didn't plan for, we also do it on an individual level. So, like, the clinician, this gives the clinician such an ability to help the youth in real time in the moment. So if they come in at month 1 and do a K10, and then again at month 3 and month 6, that in itself becomes an intervention within. So you came in and you were really distressed at the time. This is what was going on. We had a really high score, and you marked this, and this very high. Let's look at it again and see where we are now. And I have had moments where the youth have looked and said, oh my God, like, you're right, I'm doing so much better and I didn't even realize it. And we've had moments to say, hey, things are still the same. Maybe we need to take a different approach. Maybe what we're doing isn't working, and let's brainstorm and find another way. So for us, these are just a few examples, but I can't say enough about how much the Access Open Mind measures have, like, greatly improved our services and our ability to meet the needs of the youth. And it will give us the data we need to sit at tables and show proof that it is worth the investment, both financially and from patient-centered care. So that's my little plug for, let's keep this going, and let's take this team approach and get it anywhere we can, because we have seen the amazing changes for youth in the community. And thank you so much for having me to kind of share that with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather and Vidya. And so now I'll turn it over to our last set of speakers, Joanna, Sean, and Sierra.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'll just open up presentation. I'm really pleased to be with you here today. I'm coming to you from Treaty 14 and Treaty 22 lands, the lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat people. I live here with gratitude. And I also want to acknowledge that, you know, myself, Sean, Sierra, we're speaking with you today, but we're really speaking based on all of our experiences. For me personally, you know, the work that we've been doing really reflects the perspectives of thousands of young people and families, hundreds of service providers, and dozens of researchers. So it's our privilege to speak with you, but these are not exclusively our ideas. Those are our collective ideas. We have a lot to run through with you, so we're going to do our best. I'm going to speak first, then Sean, then Sierra, and Sean and Sierra will introduce themselves as we go along. Our agenda, we're going to talk about the opportunity that comes with thinking about a pan-Canadian data platform. We're going to talk about how would we actually do that? What would be the approach and the technology? We're going to say a little tiny bit about engagement and equity-centered governance. And then the most critical perspective will come from Sierra when we think about what can this mean in kind of real-world contexts. So what is the opportunity? Well, I'm bringing you full circle too. So Sam showed you this slide at the beginning. Steve has talked to us about the Federation of Integrated Youth Service Networks. These are the service providers, provincial initiatives. Vidya and Heather tremendously showed the value of data and learning health system approach. And we're going to talk to you about this piece, the Pan-Canadian Data Framework. What could it mean for young people in Canada if we moved in this direction? So what's our opportunity? Our vision is that all youth across Canada have access to high quality services that are tailored to meet their needs and support achieving optimal outcomes. We have many assets, one of which, not the only, but one of which is that integrated youth service initiatives are operating or in development in multiple provinces and territories, and collecting common data, using data to inform service development within their provinces and territories. Our gap, however, is we're missing the opportunity to build the knowledge across integrated youth services, across these provincial and territorial initiatives. So we have an opportunity to create infrastructure that would facilitate achieving better outcomes faster through partnering on a common pan-Canadian data framework and infrastructure. I'll just highlight that this also aligns with what are the intentions and the principles of the 9 province and territorial provincial integrated youth service initiatives that were part of the development of the FISN principles. And they got reflected here in the Learn and Improve component. And also align really fantastically, Vidya and Heather, I think, really demonstrated for us the value of data in practice. The question becomes, how do we pull it all together? So what do we need to achieve better outcomes faster? Well, we need to better understand the needs of diverse youth over time and over development. We're talking about 12 to 25. This is a period of incredible development. We really need to get a better handle on how the needs of youth across Canada, how their needs change over the course of development, and that we need to do that through the lens of identity, as well as intersectional experiences. We need to gain a better understanding of the services that are engaging for youth. We don't just have a problem of whether services are effective. In fact, we have many effective services. We have a problem of having those services actually be attractive to young people, actually sustain their engagement and meet their needs. And so really understanding what do services need to look like to better engage young people is critical. And how to link those young people to the services that resonate for them. We also need a better understanding of which existing treatments work from whom and under what conditions, but also a better understanding of where we need innovation. Where are there gaps so that we can drive service and treatment innovation? And really importantly, how do we create better capacity to equip policymakers with the information they need to make evidence-based decisions? I'm going to give you a few examples of how a common data platform could meet some of these needs. Sean's going to talk about the technical part. I get to talk about what I consider the fun part, because this is kind of the dreaming big part. I want to give particular shout out to all of the youth and family members who participated in a series of advisory sessions to help us think through what this could look like for young people and their families. First example, and this maps onto how to enhance capacity to understand youth needs over time and development. So we have all of the integrated youth services across the country, broadly defined. So, really thinking broadly when we say integrated youth services, able to share our data. We would be able to look at not just hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, but in fact, hundreds of thousands, millions of data points to really be able to map out how young people are doing over time, both over time and over development. This could potentially allow, some of our very wise young people and family members point out, the opportunity to identify things we don't even know about yet that might be markers for difficulties to come, that might provide an opportunity for earlier identification and the opportunity to develop interventions that could mitigate that risk that thing might be flagging. It also allows us to enhance our understanding of what is called sometimes low base rate phenomena, where we can collate data across hundreds of thousands of youth to better understand needs that arise in very particular contexts or arise amongst a smaller proportion, a considerably smaller proportion of the population. When we only look community by community or province by province, we're limited really put data together to examine some of these things that happen less frequently. Another example, and this, I think the quote across the bottom from one of our youth advisors, the second example is really about our capacity to do enhanced service matching. And this young person described this as getting rid of the noise in trying to find services. We all know, I'm sure everyone who's on this call has heard from young people, families, and others about the challenges associated with going door to door to door to door, seeking services, being maybe not offered services, sitting on wait lists, being offered services that actually aren't going to meet your needs. This is about enhancing all of us collectively, our ability as a system to do that service matching piece so that young people would be able to connect with services that match their needs from the outset. So how would this make a difference? Well, when you are collating your data across all of these different initiatives, it would allow young people to then access, because we're not just thinking about a data platform that like some people over there can access. We're talking about a data platform everyone can access. So we can all be moving the field forward. And when young people can access that data, when young people can take a look at what exists, can reflect on their own needs, can look at who else is out there, who like them sought what services, experienced what kind of service experience, experienced what kind of outcomes, that will facilitate young people being able to reach into those services. It could also create opportunities for us to push out recommended services to young people. If they wanted to, we could anticipate what their needs might be, recommend services to them. And this was, this has potential to really change how we think about mental health services, reducing stigma, creating optimal conditions for connecting to the right kind of service. The last example I'm going to give and then turn it over to Sean is really around the opportunity for policy making. when we think about bringing together all of the information from all of our communities, our collective knowledge and data across the country, it's not just about the data at sort of an individual level, it's also at the community level. Helps us to think about, and integrate all of the information we have about youth needs, service availability, service utilization, and where we have unmet needs. This kind of National Youth Mental Health Atlas will allow policymakers, everyone, to identify effective service areas, gaps in service availability, anticipate or predict upcoming service needs, and then be proactive in our policymaking, enabling us to do evidence-based decision-making. We can really look at what exists. Where do we need to invest? Where's doing something well? Where are the other communities that are similar to that community? And how might we support them in learning from that other community? I'm going to turn it over to Sean now, and then I'll be back in a couple of minutes to talk to you a little bit more.
Great, thank you, Joanna. So I'm Sean Hill. I'm the director of the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics here at CAMH in Toronto. And on the next slide, I wanted to talk, so first of all, my background is really in neuroscience, but also building large-scale data sharing infrastructures and around the world. So there are a lot of challenges in doing that. And first and foremost is, how do you want the data to be used and governed and reused by who? There's a lot of decisions there. So one of the common strategies that we've adopted is to use what's called a data federation. And that's where the individual jurisdictions keep control over their data. They structure the data in a common way, but then all of that is connected through a network to be accessible as a single database. And that's one kind of key strategy in data governance. So each partner site then is responsible for collecting the data, validating the quality, controlling access. It's important that this network be secure, be scalable, be extensible to different uses and different types of data. And generally, we try to go for open source so that there aren't large licensing fees and that this is technology that can be maintained. And so in the context of health data, there are some standards that are used globally for structuring and describing data, and this includes how the data is organized, but also the vocabulary that's used. And the two data models, is what those are called, that we use often are HL7 FHIR. It's a fast healthcare interoperability resource, and the OMOP model, which is from OHDSI. And these are standard ways of describing research studies as well as health data. And this really provides a useful way of structuring data, organizing it, making it searchable, making it accessible, and interoperably working in a large data federation. So I wanted to bring some of those points out, particularly emphasizing those federations that succeed are those that have very clear governance, very clear rules of the game of how the data gets in, how the quality is assessed, and who can use and reuse that data.
Thank you, Sean. So that's a nice segue into just sort of mentioning, before we move into hearing from Sierra, some of the really important pieces of work ahead in terms of how we actually bring a vision like this to life. And that's really about the governance considerations. All of you, I suspect most of you in the audience are familiar with integrated use services. One of the things that really differentiates integrated use services from other models of care is a really deep commitment, for the most part, to engagement and equity-centered decision making. And so what do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that decisions must be meaningfully and demonstrably reflect youth, family, community voice, and an ongoing and deep commitment to reducing health inequities. Any data governance, data platform governance framework has to, of course, reflect considerations around data sovereignty, OCAP, care principles for Indigenous data governance, EGAP, which is really focused on thinking about Black communities as well. So really existing regulations and practices and frameworks, but also thinking about how do we bring to life youth's connection to their own data as well. Our governance considerations also need to include interdisciplinary perspectives. We need to learn from existing models. We're certainly not, and Sean has lots of experience, we're not the first group who would be tackling this kind of work in terms of how to bring together very different perspectives on data and data access and data governance. Ultimately, we have to continue our work as we strive to do every day in being, really deeply collaborative. We need our structures and processes in governance to reflect these commitments. And of course, youth, family, and community voices have to be voices held by people. Humans themselves need to be embedded throughout the decision-making processes and structures. But ultimately, we also need to pay attention to efficiency, being effective, and being sustainable. We could create something really robust and it may not actually allow us to move forward. So to realize the dream, we have to balance these pieces and bring them together into a model that can really reflect the needs of real world context and ultimately move us towards our shared vision, which is better outcomes for young people throughout Canada. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sierra. Sierra, would you like to introduce yourself and share your perspectives on what we've been talking about today?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joanna. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm calling from the Treaty 3 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Ojibwe and Chippewa people. My name is Sierra Garrow, and I'm a registered psychotherapist practicing, living, and playing in Kenora, Northwestern Ontario. I'm also a youth with lived and living experience of mental illness who sits on the Youth Wellness Hub's Ontario Youth Advisory and the Foundry Ambassador Program. So if we can go to the next slide. Perfect. From a clinical standpoint, psychotherapy is only regulated in 2 provinces, and counseling therapy only regulated in 3. This means that there is potential for inconsistency in quality, professional standard, and scope of practice. We have significant variance across our country and even within our own provinces. For example, I come from a small town in Northwestern Ontario, and when I completed my training for psychotherapy, there was actually only 1 psychotherapist in my area who could supervise me for my hours to count towards my registration. This dramatically limited my ability to become registered and therefore limited the access to services in my community. So when we can look at this and we look at the variance in requirements for registration, such as education, entry to practice exams, and hours of supervision received to practice, we can see how this would create inconsistencies for treatments with our client. So through providing a learning health system, we are making information accessible to service providers, regardless of their geographical location, and allowing best practices in disciplines such as social work, psychology, occupational therapy, and so forth to be available to all service providers within Canada. This allows us to see what a small town in Alberta has done to address youth suicides in their community. And then a small town like mine in Ontario, who has a similar demographic and presenting issues, can look at implementing that here. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Instead, we need to share what works. And this needs to become our standard when we're working with children and youth mental health. When we are not putting the energy into having to recreate these ideas and approaches, we're better able to pool our resources together to solve complex issues facing our country. Often in smaller remote communities, we're required to be generalists due to the limited access to training or information. We end up throwing therapeutic darts at a dartboard and hoping something sticks. Having this system will allow us access to that most up-to-date information and effective treatment approaches. We're also then able to abolish information silos and the gatekeeping that can occur within organizational and professional circles. From a youth perspective, the system provides us the ability to have true informed consent to our treatment. If my clinician is suggesting trying an experimental therapy to treat my depression, I would want to see the research. I would want to see what populations it's been used on before and what are the anticipated side effects or risks. The same way I would want to know this information if my doctor was recommending an experimental treatment to cancer. We're also then able to remove jargon and provide plain, accessible language that removes the elitism that can be found within our research communities. We're able to incorporate multimedia presentation and methods of information delivery that can support different learning styles and required accommodations for equitable information access. It also reassures me as a youth service user that my clinicians and health team are informed of what is happening across Canada and how this can change and impact my treatment, and that they'll take this into consideration when supporting me with my goals and treatment plan. This increases trust, treatment compliance, collaboration, and overall has the potential to improve the outcomes of treatment for children and youth mental health care in our country. It puts youth in the driving seat of their care, while holding our clinicians accountable to the high standard of service that reassures me that I'm receiving the best care possible with the information and knowledge we have to date. And finally, by having a pan-Canadian platform, we normalize the experience of facing mental health challenges, and we build trust and openness to explore treatment modalities being used within our country. It demonstrates that experiencing mental illness as a youth is not a standalone experience of something unique to one community, but a problem that appears in our systems, organization, and society that needs to be addressed. It supports in dismantling oppressive practices and privileges all voices, methods of research, knowledge sources, and ways of knowing. Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to you, Joanna.
Excellent. So that ends our very quick tour of some considerations about building a pan-Canadian data platform framework. I will turn it back over to you, Ian, now, and I think we'll be moving into questions if I recall correctly.
That's right. Yeah, thank you to all the presentations and all the presenters. Very rich talks, and I think really demonstrates the tremendous amount of work that's been done to date, and I think the very exciting future we have for integrated youth services. And now I'll pass it over to my colleague Alana to run the question and answer.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. So I will encourage you all to write your questions or comments in the chat. If you'd like to actually speak and make a comment or ask a question directly to our wonderful speakers today, please just let us know and I can call on you. To get us started, I definitely have a few questions. I'm sure others do too. I think you've given us lots to think about, so thank you for that. I think one of the things that I very much heard through that was consistent throughout all the presentations is the importance to connect practice to data, to knowledge. And really, what I'm hearing is the large vision for greater collaboration, knowledge sharing, and data collection, which really is developing a learning health system. And one of the things I'm wondering, and you can see who wants to answer this question, is if you can speak to how the development of a learning health system can help smaller jurisdictions as well as rural and remote communities. Because I think a lot of the examples that we've spoken about have been in larger contexts. And so wondering if anyone can speak to how this might benefit those young people and Canadians living in smaller jurisdictions and rural and remote communities.
I don't want to put Sierra on the spot, but Sierra, would you want to say, someone sitting in a community that's you know, people would identify as rural. Do you want to?
Yeah, definitely. I can speak to it. Would you just be able to say the question one more time?
Sure. And I think really, you know, we've been talking today about developing learning health systems and the importance of knowledge sharing, data collection, greater collaboration, and just wondering how you think that has benefited maybe you in your community, and how you think that would benefit others living in more rural and remote communities across the country.
For sure. So I spoke a little bit to it earlier. When we are generalists, we have to be diverse in, you know, the skill set that we have and what we're kind of offering our clients, because we're doing the best we can with the limited resources we have, whether that's, you know, funding issues that come up, or whether that's we're not actually able to have the infrastructure. So for example, Kenora doesn't have a Schedule 1 hospital for youth. We are only able to accommodate adults. And so these become very significant barriers to treatment, where now for a youth to be able to get support, you're uprooting them from their community, their support system, from what they know and it's familiar for them, and now sending them 6 hours away to Thunder Bay to receive treatment and support. Oftentimes, their families cannot go with them because you're taking off significant time from work and you need to continue supporting your family and household. And so when we look at how, you know, an ability like this to provide globalized information, we are able to then adjust and have advocacy points of what the best practices are. We're able to go forward and speak to what our communities need, what are we seeing that's working across our country, and how can we use those as advocacy points to increase the services in those remote communities. And so as a youth who's navigated the system with a lot of frustration and had 3 suicide attempts before I was actually able to get the support that I needed, this is life-changing. This is something I wish I had years ago. And I think this will support youth and families as we move forward and we continue to grow and understand how can we put them in the driving seat so they are getting the care that they need, when they need it, from who they need it from.
Thanks, Sierra. I think, you know, the other thing that struck me from Heather and Vidya's presentation was, you know, Heather's living in a smaller community as well. And Heather, I don't know if you're still there or not. Oh, great. And you spoke so much about the value of data, and I think all of you have presented the large vision for, you know, if we are collecting common data and sharing, really the impact that we can have on Canadian young people and their families and caregivers. But I also know just from talking to you that there can be challenges to collecting data. And so I'm wondering, maybe I can start with you, Heather, and then turn it over to Vidya if there's anything to add, but what some of those challenges to collecting data have been, and how maybe you overcame those.
Yeah. Well, you know, there is challenges to creating data, to collecting data. And one of the things we were always worried about in our context was we really needed access to know that we are treating young people first and we're doing protocols second. And so, you know, the challenge for me a lot of times, even as the therapist in the room, was, is this the appropriate time to bring these measures out? And like, it's a little different than some of the other services where the youth knew they were coming in only for perhaps data collection and being part of the access program, where youth accessing our services were coming for mental health treatment and were agreeing to go into the access program. And so, and I still am worried, always on guard of like, when you bring those measures in, are you creating a disconnection in the ability to provide services? I never do it in the first session. I do whatever we need to within the intake interview for baseline. And then I build rapport and I do that in the first session. So one thing is, don't put the measures over the person in front of you. The other thing we noticed, just as a small rural community in our context, and this would probably be different in other communities, is we needed to keep them on paper, because whenever we brought a device into the room that separated the people, automatically something is lost in the relationship. And so that was a learning lesson for us, and a little bit of extra work to collect the data on paper and then transfer it into the system. And what does that look like? The other challenge is it is hard to see, like, we are privileged in Eskizoni because we're a large community. So a lot of the federal funding is based on the size of the communities. And then we have smaller Indigenous communities around us who are suffering and are not have the ability to gain the same services. So one thing that our data has helped us do is help other communities get to use our example to go to governments and say, hey, you funded a clinician at Eskizoni. This is what they needed. This is what we need. And can we, bring them along with it? And I can give you an example of psychiatry. We were desperate to have a psychiatrist in the community. There's no access in Nova Scotia. I'm a psychologist. I do an assessment. I say you need psychiatry. And since I'm not part of the larger system, they have to go into Sydney, sit on a waiting list for a year to see a psychologist, to do an assessment, to get psychiatry. Absolutely terrible processing. We went out and we smoothed and made a relationship with our own psychiatrist. And now we have psychiatry in the community every 2 weeks. Telehealth in from Yarmouth. And I can't tell you how many communities around us have reached out and said, how did you do that? We desperately need to do that. So when you guys speak about sharing knowledge, like, that is absolutely important, because the smaller communities are suffering and they don't have the access to the funds that larger communities do. Hope that helps a little.
Thanks. Steve, I'm wondering, there's a question in the chat just around how you get buy-in from all of the organizations to be collecting the same data. And I'm wondering, Steve or Joanna, given that you're working at a provincial scale and working with multiple communities that have multiple organizations involved, I'm wondering if you can share any of the lessons you've learned about how to get buy-in for collecting the same data.
I think it's not so much the collection of, the collection of data is an important issue, but I think it's how the data is used that's really, really critical, and working with communities and community organizations to understand the value of the data, so that it's not something that just gets sequestered in some academic center and that folks never see again. And I think that that's been the real the real shift, and also the work ahead, which continues to be to support clinicians, to support youth and families to better understand what is being collected and what it actually means. And then to actually kind of take a step back and say, okay, is this the right data? Are we asking the right questions? Do these questions actually matter to young people? Or were they designed to help us understand what medication to prescribe? Because that's probably not the questions we should be asking. So I think that's the reality of where we are, is that historically, as a psychiatrist, I've been very much not a data gatherer. I haven't used data historically to really guide me and to understand whether or not I've been successful in helping a young person. So that's a shift. And for a lot of clinicians, that's something that they're not used to doing. And it's also not been something that we've done in terms of providing feedback to our communities to talk about whether or not we've been successful in helping folks, who is falling through the cracks. When we talk about equity, equitable access, for instance, to services, social justice, those are issues that we find in urban centers as well as rural centers. And I know we tend to kind of say, well, rural is underserved, but there are a lot of pockets within urban communities where folks are getting no service access whatsoever. And I think we tend to almost forget that a lot of service access is socioeconomic. It's parents who have double incomes or have a high income from one parent, which allows for another parent to drive to appointments at 1 o'clock in the afternoon across town because they have two cars. And so I think that there's a lot of ways that we can use data to help communities better distribute those resources, make sure those resources are accessible. And I'll say this again, I still think that we have a big deficit when it comes to actual investment in youth mental health in this country. We have a gap. We have not sufficiently invested in youth mental health, and we can only show that by using data. And I think that that's critical. I came from a site visit in Williams Lake, which is a community of 15,000. They got their first addiction counselor about 2 years ago. Their first in a community of 15,000, in a community that had 24 overdose deaths in the last 2.5 years of young people. And that is, it's bewildering to me that we have those types of situations. But that is the kind of, I think, thing that we can inform when we have good data and we can support communities to argue for more resources. And I do see that as a positive, the work that we do.
Thanks, Steve. Joanna, did you want to add something?
Sure. I think in addition to what Steve's described, in terms of how we actually support organizations and service providers to shift, I think partly it's also, and Steve alluded to this for sure, it's really about measurement-based care. And I think young people expect services that work. They have reasonable questions about, is this treatment going to work? And we owe it to young people to actually be able to answer that question. So part of it is really being able to provide meaningful, exactly as, I think the point about the meaningfulness of the measures is really critical one. But we need to be able to show young people need to be able to access their own data to see how they're doing over time. And service providers, clinicians need to also be able to see how are things going over time. We know that when we monitor young people's, anyone's progress over time on a health condition, that it actually can improve outcomes. And the other thing I would just say before I acknowledge Ian's hand is up, which is kind of awkward, but I'll just say that we have to also approach this from an evidence-based practice perspective. So we really need to, there's a whole implementation science domain of research that can help us learn how to support change, especially big transformative change like this. And so that's another consideration, I think. But I will turn it back over to you, Ian.
I'm going to take it, Ian. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, and then I'll turn it over to you, Ian. Because I think you're right. Joanna and Steve, just having spoken to you before, and what you're hearing is, and what we heard through the presentations earlier is, I think part of it is, as we start collecting data and asking questions, we may start to realize that new questions and new measures need to be developed. Especially as young people are evolving, the needs of young people are evolving, and how do we help to support that evolution? And so even the measures may need to evolve. Vidya, I want to ask you one of the questions that came out in the chat, and you've presented a lot of great data and really showed how when you ask young people and clinicians, you can use that data. But we also know that what young people need in terms of data interests is different than what clinicians are looking for, is often different than policymakers. And so I'm wondering if, based on your experience, you have any advice on how do we balance that focus and interest of what data is important and what do we measure, and also recognizing that different people in different communities are at different points in their journey. And so how might we balance the various needs and desires for data amongst people?
Thanks, Alana. And I think that there's one or two really interesting comments in the chat that speak to this question, I think, that you were trying to summarize. I think that is actually both the challenge and the opportunity we have in this space, that from the very beginning, we've wanted to engage in this sort of space where we want to try and figure out how do we bring different people and different perspectives together and hear those and negotiate and navigate. I think from the very beginning, we've actually embraced that challenge. One thing that I will say is that sometimes I think when we're looking at the data question, we may want to simultaneously be able to think about it both from a like more like a top down or a vision and a bottom up perspective, so that we can really see, every, like the question that somebody asked, like, how do we find a space for everyone, from an individual young person to an individual clinician to an individual hub to a provincial network to the nation, like, so that we really find a space for everyone. And to also creatively, in some ways, I think we have the opportunity to creatively think about data, so that it doesn't seem always like, measures that people need to fill out. Like, we can really think about how can there be some quick feedback from a technology, like a young person might feel like saying something quickly, from like using real world, real time experience data, rather than always thinking more traditionally, which is how we've done. Like, and that might kind of also address this gap that we're thinking about of, how do we create buy-in, and then how does that data become useful to clinicians, because clinicians also need real world data. So it's a nice sort of way of thinking both about the question of how do we make this feasible, and how do we increase buy-in, and in some ways learn from fields outside of health. Like, like in the bird watching field, a lot of it is really about different people who are interested in birds taking pictures about birds they've spotted, and from that they've been able to trace amazing stuff about migration and flight patterns. What I'm trying to say is that we really need to think a little bit differently. We don't want to approach how we're thinking about data with the same imagination from the past. If we're thinking differently, we need to go all the way out there and think it's possible, but do it both from top down and bottom up, so that everyone has a space in this.
Thanks, Vidya. I think there's lots to think about there, and I'm sure the other panelists have lots to add to that. Given our time constraints, I'm going to turn it over to Ian for the next question. And don't worry, Tracy and Grace, I've seen your question. We'll get to that as well. Over to you, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Elena. And I suppose, this is maybe best initially answered by Sam, but I welcome if any of the other presenters have thoughts. But so Sam, I wonder if you could share a little bit that, with integrated use services, as we know, there's a wide variation in kind of the state of development of integrated use services across our 13 jurisdictions. We're seen presentations from leaders who have very well developed networks, but there are some that are still are under development. There are others where really discussions have just begun. And so I thought that it might be helpful for you, if you could, to talk about how would IYSnet be tailored to jurisdictions at different stages of development, so that, hopefully all of them can benefit.
Well, thanks, Ian. It's a great question, and we've thought about this a lot. I think that the way IYSnet is being set up is to support the 13 provinces and territories, both individually and collectively. So the idea is that we would provide the research funding to ensure that they are able to effectively collect data and use information to inform their local jurisdictions for best practices and best outcomes for youth. Now, some jurisdictions may have smaller populations, may not have as many researchers available. So the idea is to bring them together and possibly pair up some of the provinces with others, some of the territories with provinces initially, utilize research infrastructure that may exist proximally, but not directly within their jurisdiction. So they're actually sharing the ability that some of the larger jurisdictions and the more experienced jurisdictions have. The goal would be that within 5 years, each province and territory would have its own data collection, research infrastructure, and sharing capabilities. We have to recognize that there's a population issue, there's a geography issue, there's a human resource issue, but if everybody's connected, then you have an opportunity to collaborate effectively. That's the sort of the concept behind IYSnet, and I really am quite confident that this is doable. So I've seen it done in the context of the Canadian Research Initiative in Substance Misuse, the network of networks that CIHR has been running for the last 7 years, where all jurisdictions actually collaborate both on studies, on data, on knowledge transfer. In the first few years, we relied heavily on some of the higher population areas because they had much stronger infrastructure, but they've actually helped their fellow Canadians in other jurisdictions to build that up, such to the point now where there is infrastructure in pretty much every province and territory to be able to collect data and to work collaboratively. So we're building that model, using that model for IYSNet, a network of networks, but recognizing different levels of development. And we will do everything in our power to ensure that each jurisdiction can come up to speed while immediately benefiting from the knowledge of others.
And Sam, if certain jurisdictions want to learn more or think about the next step, what would you suggest?
Well, there's going to be, as the next phase of IYSNet rolls out, there will be invitations for all the jurisdictions to come together to talk about their research capabilities, their data capabilities, so that when it is launched, they have already been sitting at the table talking about research and data, but not unlike how they've been sitting at the table talking about service delivery and knowledge mobilization and best practices with Steve. It's just a different community of researchers that will then, of course, align with their jurisdiction and with those who are the decision makers and service delivery folks. They will be given that opportunity, and we would expect that each province and territory ultimately will be nominating the research leaders to work with the other research leaders across the country. Ultimately, if we get it right, those three sectors, the service delivery sector, the research sector, and the data gathering sectors, will all overlap as one. But it's a work in progress, right? The nice thing is, as you've seen, both from what Steve presented, the willingness to actually put all of your best practices out there for others, to translate them into other languages for others. The abilities to share are already happening as we speak. So it's not like we have to convince people to share. It's a question now of implementing it. And I think, as everybody has said or has left unsaid, to resource it properly so it can be done. This could be the model of how mental health and allied services are delivered for all ages in this country. But we have to first demonstrate that we can do it effectively in a learning health system model. And that's why I say it's the most exciting thing I've ever been involved with. And Steve's going, I hope it works for you. But at the end of the day, look at this team of people that are working together. I mean, it's an amazing opportunity. And it'd be so good for the youth of Canada to know that our goal is not to leave a single youth without access to services. And we mean it. And that's what the minister is talking about. And she'll hear more about that tomorrow from many of the same people here. And I think it is it's like building the railway across the country, right? It's a way to bind this country together by providing services for the next generation and making sure that there is to the greatest potential possible, there are no gaps and nobody's left behind. This is what's so critically important. And I love the data that was presented, that Vidya presented, about how underserved populations are already recognizing that this is where they can, bridge gaps that they've had in the past. And how, as we continuously learn, we'll make sure that those who need the services the most are first in line to get those services. That's the objective of the entire exercise. But you can see how you need to do it through a collective approach and a learning health system approach for it to be successful.
Thanks, Sam. I think there's a question, and maybe just quickly, of how young people and caregivers will be involved in this vision from the beginning, rather than as an afterthought? And maybe just for the sake of time, if you have a 30-second answer to that, Sam.
Well, I mean, I'm not the driver of change that Vidya, Joanna, Steve are, but I can say that from everything that I've seen from the get-go, youth are driving this. Their voices carry the most weight in this conversation because, after all, if you don't understand what the needs are, how can you possibly create the services of the future? And those services have to be tailored to the needs. And Canada's got a remarkably wonderful, diverse community. We just now have to make sure that services are inclusive and equitable to that diverse community. And that's why all these voices need to be heard. And from what I've learned from all of the networks, the youth councils are at the epicenter of determining which services, how they're delivered, how youth participate, how data is gathered. All of it has the youth's perspective as the primary driver.
And I'll just add a maybe controversial piece, but it's also why it's important that we don't necessarily have institutions brought in to do the work for us. This is something that should be led by the folks who've been doing the work and working with young people for decades. And we should be supported by institutions to do this work, but certainly it shouldn't be led by those institutions to do the work, because everything is evolving with young people involved. All the work around learning health systems, our conversations that we're having with young people and care providers and caregivers, and policymakers. So we just don't want to disrupt what has been happening by necessarily having outside organizations come in and work on this or lead it. We really want to continue to evolve this in partnership like we have. And we're seeing that with the Federation. We're seeing that with IYSnet. It's really quite exciting, and we want to continue to see that happen.
And I think, Sierra, I'm not going to call on you right now, but you being here and your experience that you've shared to date really demonstrates how you've been involved in or helping to shape this work. So I think it's a concrete example to answer that question. I'm also conscious that there were several questions around, I think probably aimed at Sean, around a data framework and what's been done, data infrastructure and governance and what's been done elsewhere. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time to get into all of those examples, but I'm wondering, Sean, if you can speak to where people might be able to find out some more information about what's been done, as well as maybe just quickly tell us, what you think could be a next step to moving this work forward.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, there have been many different efforts establishing many different kinds of data infrastructures. Some examples of jointly funded work between the US and EU and Canada was actually on traumatic brain injury, where a whole data infrastructure was set up to share data across countries. Now, that's much larger than what we're talking about here, but I think the very similar principles apply about having a clear agreement on each jurisdiction and what role are they playing in sharing data. I think that there's no single resource that I can point you to, unfortunately, to go and learn about all of these different efforts. There have been many different ones at many different scales, funded by, in the US and Europe, as well as in Canada. And unfortunately, very, very often, there's a lot of reinvention, and there's a lot of recreating the wheel, not necessarily learning from other existing initiatives. And so I think one of the challenges is exactly to do some of that review of, have there been good examples of data sharing? We have them right here in this federation. So I think, building off of the lessons learned, building a robust governance model is first and foremost, the critical piece, and then simply taking the first step of implementing maybe a prototype. First few nodes, how does that work? What are the issues that come up? How do you start to get this operational and growing from there? To me, that's the natural way to start.
Thanks so much, and thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their insights. I think for me, really what I heard today was the opportunity we have in Canada to develop a learning health system in integrated youth services, and what an opportunity it is, and to set the example within the mental health space for learning health systems. I think we really heard that within the learning health system, it's so important to connect the services or the practices, the data, and develop the data infrastructure, and then share that knowledge to further inform services and practice. And we were, really appreciative for the concrete examples we heard today about the value of collecting data and how it can be used to better understand service delivery, adapt service delivery, and ultimately improve better outcomes. And I think, at the end of the day, what I take away is that there's such an importance for us to collaborate, to develop a governance structure that allows for equity and voices to be heard throughout, but also for ownership where within each jurisdiction. And so really there's an opportunity for us to think together about how do we move this work forward. And I think ultimately the vision is how can we use the development of a learning health system to achieve better outcomes for young people and their caregivers faster, because there is no doubt, and especially coming out of the pandemic, that there is huge need and huge desire from young people and their caregivers and families to be accessing services now. And so how do we help achieve better outcomes faster? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ian.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you to all the speakers. I feel like, we're so lucky to have all of you people helping the youth of this country. You're incredibly dedicated and are doing incredible work. So just thank you for all that you do. I think, at the foundation, like I said, I think, we've been sort of working on this for 10 years, and I think incredibly excited about the next 10 years. Incredible progress has been made, and I think really a tremendous amount of exciting work to come, and to really make sure that integrated youth services achieves its promise. And so thank you very much. And I also want to just bring your attention to an evaluation of the webinar. We'd love it if you could give us, just fill out the very simple evaluation. I think there's 4 questions, and just let us know what you think and what you thought of the webinar, and suggestions for future. Gohar has put the link in the chat. We'll also be sending out an email to you shortly with the evaluation. We'll also be sending you a recording of this webinar, so that if you want to go over parts of it again, or yeah. So, and I think with that, we'll say goodbye to everyone. Thank you very much to all the people that attended. I hope that you found this valuable.